In insurance, I don't know, I can't really pigeonhole you in the sense of your cross industries, but either way, AI is seen as a black box. So how have you built trust with your customers in that regard, in terms of saying, hey, we have a solution that will ingest your data and give you some value, yet you still don't understand how it's working? Maybe Somet will start with you.
Yeah, sure. So I think in the many earlier discussions, we've spoken about what technology can do for most industries, but I think the one thing we have to be cognizant about is a lot of stuff is not going to change overnight. So in the insurance world, things move a little bit more slower than other industries, and so there's things where I'll give you a good example is, we're doing digital, we're trying to do a lot more digital inspections on vehicles. However, many times that gets challenged in court. So if we're doing it for valuation, yes, the AI can look at the vehicle almost to an extent by science, tell you the value of the vehicle. However, because of market dynamics and the way in which cars are priced in Kenya, which is different to other markets where you have very set standard data sets around prices of parts, prices of vehicles, in Kenya things are kind of different. So we've had to make sure that there's always a human being in the loop. And earlier in my slide, I said it's important that you do not completely automate and eliminate human beings. And simply because you still, as much as AI can do things very well, and they only can do one thing really well at a time, we haven't gotten to a point of super intelligence where AI can do multiple things at the same time. ChatGPT makes it look like it, but that's not the reality. And so we've had to make sure that there is still a human being in the loop where they're using AI to complement their work, not AI replacing them. And that's the only way we build trust, is going back to insurers and says, we still have a human being look at these reports. The AI helps them make decisions faster, but the decision finder is still held by a human being.
Great. Maybe a follow-up question on that, especially because you're in the insurance space. What are your thoughts around what you call the push versus pull model? Right now you're going to insurance companies saying, hey, here's something that will help you save money, while at the same time there's a school of thought that said, what if you started with the consumer first, and the consumer demanded that the insurance company then adopts these technologies to be able to give them better pricing? One is a B2B, one is a B2C.
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting question. I think and I can answer it in very many different ways. So that a lot of the challenge in Kenya in the insurance space is there's still a lot of education that needs to happen to consumers around what is important for them to know and own about a car. So I'm sure a majority of the people in this room drive cars, but I'm sure very few people know, even if you pay for a comprehensive cover, it actually only covers you in the course of an accident. Anything outside that, you're kind of on your own. Most people, half of the time when you're getting insurance for your vehicle, you have no idea what you're entitled to, what you should ask for, where things should go. And then a lot of, like if you think about accidents, where a lot of the changes that technology can play a role is driven more by the insurer than it is by the consumer. So what we've ended up actually realizing, a lot of the people or groups of people that are pushing the change in the insurance industry is actually agents and brokers, because they're the ones who interface more with consumers. They're the ones who bear the burden of a lot of these admin and operational stuff. So they're the ones saying, hey, how do we digitize things a lot more to make decisions faster, to get you your insurance faster, to make sure your claim gets processed faster? And they're the ones actually who are pushing insurance company heavily to digitize and use a lot more of these technologies.
Yeah, great insight. I'll come to you, Bernard. Then, same question. This element of trust. I'm a manufacturer. I allow you to plug in. How do I know that, number one, my data is going to be safe? How do you account for, what LLMs are you using? Are those running publicly? Are those custom models running on your own hardware? How do you build that trust layer, number one? And number two is, what are you actually, using under the hood?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. We're having a similar discussion with a client yesterday, basically they were asking about the hardware setup or the infrastructure setup and things like that. The first thing is education, user education. The industries where we operate in, these are industries that are run by veterans of the industry that have been in that space for say 50, 60 years. So when you come to pitch them what an LLM is, they don't know what you're talking about. They only know, if you ask them about AI, they only know ChatGPT and maybe Siri for those who use iPhones. So you can imagine telling this person, okay, we have to move your entire data to this model that is going to read it and understand it and transform it into a way that your team can use it or get it back into your system. So you have to basically start educating them, okay, what is AI? What can it do? And what value can it give to your business? So once they have that basic understanding of how it can transform their business, then we go to the second layer of now saying, okay, for us to be able to achieve this set of KPIs or objectives that you have as a business, these are the things that we have to sort out. And obviously, the thing with most of these technologies is you have to find the early adopters or the enthusiasts who are basically able to move quickly with you, despite them knowing the risks of the technology. So initially, that's the first set of guys that are able to understand what you're saying, understand the value, and be able to pitch it to their business. Second thing is practically showing them how you are taking the question of security into accountability. So an example, you'll tell them, for example, if we are ingesting, say, a bunch of POs on a daily basis from, say, email, we redact a bunch of information when we are passing that data to a certain model that we use. And you show them as an example, this is how actually it works. This is how it reads your email. This is how it moves. This is how, it's like technically you are educating a 1 year old how to use, say, a computer. You have to show them the actual buttons. When you tell them about an LLM, they're like, okay, let's talk next year. So you have to come close to their language, and you have to show them practically how you are basically addressing these questions as a layman. So user education is very important. Secondly is being able to be where their IT teams are at. So we have to understand, okay, how is their IT infrastructure set up? Do they have on-prem solutions? Do they have on-cloud solutions? Do they have a hybrid? And how do we fit in? Based on how that has been set up, we now work with their IT team to see how do we now embed the Sanifu system into that entire workflow. If they are running some of the system on-prem, obviously we have to tell them, okay, there's some things or microservices we can't run on on-prem because it requires distributed architecture, for example. So once the IT team understands that bit in terms of how that is taken care of, then the end user basically is just usage. So user education is very important. Being able to show them how the data actually moves in the system. Being able to also provide, say, a trial period for them to see, okay, within 6 months when I'm trying your system, if something goes amiss, then I'm not working with you guys. So that basically builds that element of trust when you give them the free trial period. And lastly, their IT teams are very, very important. We have to understand how their IT infrastructure is set up and how they'll prefer Sanifu to be set up in their workflow. And lastly is the economic buyer. I mean, you might do all these things, but the finance, as you say, the finance will say, your pesa tu nasai. I remember we had a case where we were, in fact, we almost said, hii kitu ni kama mtaki, acha tuongee tu next year, where the finance guy was saying, whatever you guys are automating, I can get an intern for Strathmore. Akuja afanye. So what are you telling me? You'll charge me X amount of money per month to be able to do this. So you can imagine, finance people are all like that. So they have to look at the unit economics. So you have to tell the guy, okay, the reason why you're paying 3x what you're paying an intern is because of ABCD. So once they understand also that, you now build a different level of trust about what it's able to do, essentially. So generally, yeah, those are the core areas that we look at.
You spoke into the lady from Kala, Dalia asked about the human elements, and you've just mentioned one of them. And within the same thread, that's a part of the conversation. What is your typical, sales cycle? Because you're dealing in B2B, and you've seen the kind of companies that Sanifu actually provides services to. What's that typical sales cycle?
Oh man, that's selling software in Africa is one of the hardest things to do, especially in Kenya where people who are using cracked software, you are using cracked QuickBooks or cracked, Microsoft. Now imagine coming to sell to that person a solution that will cost them $2,000-3,000 a month. How will they buy the solution? The typical sales cycle is between 3 to 6 months, in some cases 1 year. 1 year in cases where you are dealing with a multinational, maybe they have operations in Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, Europe, and places like that. 6 months if you're dealing with a continental where someone is only operating within East Africa, and 3 months if someone is operating only in Kenya. And we are very, very particular on the guys we are targeting right now. These are guys who have to, we call them, they have fire on their heads. They're looking for something to put it off. You're not going there to convince them to see the other side of the world, because startups have limited runway and you have to move quickly with whoever is ready to move. So those are the guys we are always looking for. We are looking for someone who is basically saying, I want this today, I want this in the next 1 month, I want it to see it up and running. I have to give credit to actually Kenchik. Kenchik actually, they had even contracted someone to do it for them, but it couldn't work. And we were in those early days of doing an MVP, trying to figure out who is the paying customer, and we got this weird call from a user who had just signed up from them. And they worked with us to basically refine the system and have it into what it is today. So number one, we look at the urgency of the problem. How urgent is the problem? Do they want to just have AI in their company, or do they actually want to solve a problem? The first red flag we see is if someone they are looking at, we want to do AI, that's a red flag for us. It has to be, what problem do you want to solve? If you are just looking for AI, they'll give you a buy-in within a week, but they'll churn off within, say, 3 months because their KPIs around AI haven't been met when they're not prioritizing the user.
Great. So, gentlemen, you always, as an entrepreneur myself, I always put the good stuff on the decks. So I want us to discuss maybe some of the ugly stuff that may have happened, and we'll start with you, Somet. When you've deployed these solutions, you've got partners, what has been your worst day, and what happened then?
My worst day is interesting. So and the insurance industry is a very interesting one to look at, because you put in a lot of technology in I'll give you a good example. Actually, I think my worst days are when I'm trying to convince people why AI is important for them, and you get very, very interesting pushback. So I'll give you a fun, interesting example. So I was having this conversation with an insurance company around how ideally they could use AI to give them visibility of a vehicle, either so if you think about, most of people buy cars in Mombasa. Between the time you get it in Mombasa, drive it to Nairobi, and get your insurance, anything could happen. More often than not, your insurance company has no visibility of that car. Or another example, you get an accident on the road in the middle of the night. The earliest an insurer will send anyone to you is the next day in the following morning. So your insurer has no visibility of what happens between scene of accident to when the insurer gets there. You know, you go to a garage as a value or an assessor, you find your mechanic has stripped out all the parts, put them on the floor. You can't tell whether this headlamp came from this car or they damaged their car creatively. And so getting a lot of insurance companies to say, how do you use this technology to just give you, send the guy a WhatsApp link, and you have, this is what the vehicle looks like. And then you get very interesting questions like, can you put together weather data, satellite imagery, and tell me if this accident actually happened in this place in the middle of the night? And I say, cool, yes. I can build the technology. Will you pay for it? Because satellite imagery is expensive, weather data is expensive, but also what use case are we solving? Because if it's visibility of the vehicle, if it's you want to understand what this car looks like, doing an inspection at night doesn't help you. Even a human being will not be able to do a proper assessment of a vehicle at night. There's only so much torches can do to give you light. So most of the time, it's getting questions where you realize very quickly this is not a question that somebody actually wants to solve a problem. Rather, it's either a pushback because they haven't spent the time to understand what technology can do, what's the boundaries. So a lot of it is more getting people to understand, listen, I'm not here to completely eradicate your team. What I'm trying to help you do is have very good visibility of what's happening within your ecosystem. So think about pricing of parts. If you'd, and I'll give you another anecdote insurance companies have, they would never allow an assessor valuer to do both the valuation and assessment of the same car. But if you think about it, if I valued this vehicle at the first insurance, wouldn't I be the best person to tell you when a claim happens if this was the right vehicle? So you spread that across and you have, yes, you're doing a damage assessment on this car, but you have no idea what it looked like. And that's where a lot of fraud starts to happen. So I think my biggest challenge is the industry I work in is very set in its ways. And question you asked earlier around sales cycle, sometimes it takes up to a year or two to just get sort of that conversion across.
Great. It reminds me of a conversation we had a few weeks ago. Once upon a time, I also dabbled in the insurance space, and there was this interesting telematic service that was automated. The airplanes have black boxes, so that if anything happens, they say, we just need to find this orange box and we'll know what happened before. And it was interesting. My worst day during that environment, when you're presenting to a massive insurance company that had one of the largest car insurance books, is one of the people actually said, so you mean this thing has to be tracking me every day and everywhere I go? I'm like, it's machines that are talking to each other. There's no human sitting there. But you find that the distilled pushback was from a human condition, because it's like, okay, you'll be able to determine that my car was parked in Ruaraka near USIU. You can infer what that means, right? It was a human pushback saying, okay, suddenly there's a social cultural issue that this technology threatens. And literally, they said, maybe you should try this in a more mature market like South Africa. And that was the worst day, because after all that entire 6-month, 8-month sales cycle, a whole project dies because of an element like that. So some things are not necessarily challenges in the technical sense, and we still need to figure out this human socialization aspect where people can actually see real value. Bernard, I'm really curious about what your worst day has been with Sanifu, client-facing, and how you mitigated that.
Right. Client-facing. There are a couple. So every day you are having something that some fire you're putting off somewhere. And I remember an experience with a customer, one of the customers who wanted to use our services. And they called us in, we went for a meeting, we did a nice presentation, and they said, okay, you guys, this is really good, and I want to give this a try, but it lacks ABCD. Can you guys go and build ABCD, then come back to me? Went back, built the ABCD I wanted, pitched, and he said, okay, it's not there yet. So imagine all that time you've already spent, like, say, 3 months or 4 months building that ABCD they wanted. We went back, built a couple of more additions in terms of what they wanted, and we went back again to pitch. So 6 months had passed, and going back, we found that the guy had left. The guy wanted to approve the solution, he had left. So we were like, okay. So the new guy told us, now I have to take this back to the CEO for them to approve. So by that time we had spent probably thousands of dollars building the new versions of whatever they needed. And we had already, I remember that time we had limited runway, and we were like, okay, how do we get ourselves out of this situation? Because we were actually relying on this contract for us to get things moving. And the guy tells you, we have to start this again, and we knew that's another 6-month cycle. So we had to essentially go back to the drawing board, specifically think about what value do we want to offer the market, because you can't build every feature that a customer tells you. So at that time we were like, okay, we have to sort of orient ourselves to saying no to clients. Because if you say yes to everyone, then you'll basically end up with a bloated solution that does everything but does nothing. What that means is essentially it's like you have almost 100 features, none is built end to end, it's not solving a core problem, and you basically have a bunch of people who are using it and they end up churning within, say, 2 months or 3 months. So we had to figure out, okay, we need to nail down our customer, we need to nail down the target market, we have to nail down who we are selling this to, and things like that. So once we made that decision, then selling became a bit easier. So by that time we were doing something else that is different from Sanifu. We were basically doing something a bit for small businesses space, and we had to make the hard decision of pivoting to enterprise. And that whole conversation basically summarized it was a pivot hell. It was really, really hard for us to figure out who are we selling to, especially in Kenya. So we were like, even if it means selling to a few, because Kenya doesn't have large enterprise customers, there are very few. So we have to figure out the only way to make a scalable business out of this is we have to build for Kenya, look for businesses that are meeting this criteria. If we exhaust all of them in Kenya, we have to go to the US and Europe. And that's what we did, and it ended up pretty much serving us quite well.
And I think that's really interesting. Actually, the pivot you guys made from SME, then go to the large enterprises. And yes, recently I've also seen you travel quite a bit on and off the continent. What were those nuances when you're thinking about AI solutions for SMEs versus the enterprise?
Oh man, SMEs, what I remember there was this discussion we were having. So we were like, okay, we are going to help small businesses automate collection we were basically doing collection of debt or credit for small businesses. So we're like, okay, why are we automating this for them? We want to save them time. So we kept asking, okay, this time that we're saving them, what will they do with that time? Because you're basically enabling like a shop somewhere to automate collection of their credit, and that guy is seated there the entire day. So this extra time you are saving them, what are they going to use with it? So we were like, oh, that's a dead end. And actually that's what we discovered. Like we built something for SMEs, but for them, whatever solution you are selling to an SME, they care about two things. One, is it making me money? Whatever solution you're selling me, can it help me make more money? Or can it help me save money? And I have to see the money you've saved for me, not like theoreticals of what you enable me save. So in Africa, the only visible thing you can actually help a small business do is basically make them money, because it's hard to quantify the money you've saved someone for a small business. So we had to move entirely from there. So I would say that's the only KPI a small business care about. Compare that to enterprise. Enterprise customers care about a different set of KPIs because of the different departments. The different departments have different things they care about. Maybe finance, they want to ensure that payments are made correctly. Maybe sales, they want to ensure that products are moving out quickly. Maybe in procurement, they want to ensure that they are getting the right vendors for specific products. So cost is not really an issue for the large companies, especially if you're selling to the right customer. Cost is usually not an issue. So the KPIs or the objectives and the goals for large enterprises, let me say they're relatively a bit easier to figure out what you're selling to, as opposed to say SMEs where you're only just caring about one KPI and you have to basically work your solution around what the SME cares about.
I think that's a fantastic insight right there, because many times, even when you talk percentages, I'm going to increase your revenue by X. 5% for an SME might not justify the cost of even the value of the product you've built, but for a large enterprise, if you quantify whether it's new revenue or a better bottom line from cost savings, 5% for a 10 billion shilling company in terms of turnover is significant. And I guess that kind of like almost is a balm on the business, the time it takes to actually close on these accounts. I'd like to open this conversation to there's already a hand up there. Is there any other person apart from that gentleman first? I'll give it to the lady at the front first, and then we'll come to you. If you have any questions for these two gentlemen. Name, organization, please.
Good morning. My name is Deborah Tendo. I'm a writer for Samsung. And you asked him the question on data security, and it was not answered. So I'd like to know from both of them, and especially him, the one who deals with data a lot, what is the infrastructure on basically the app that they're trying to build when they're selling to customers? Because as we've seen, AI, a lot of trust is needed because it's a new thing, and especially in Africa, that's why it's very difficult to sell it. So I'd like to know, when it comes to now data privacy, data security, what is the infrastructure? What are you selling?
Great, I think that's for you. I'll look under the hood.
Yeah, so just to simplify it, I'll avoid a lot of technical language. So number one, every data we process has an end-to-end encryption from whatever you are picking it from is encrypted to where we are taking it is encrypted. So it has, they call it military-grade encryption. That ensures that no one is intercepting that data on transit. So for example, if you are moving data or a bunch of documents, say from Outlook, and we are moving those documents, say to SAP as an example, we have to ensure that all that process, there's a bit of encryption at least at every stage to ensure that whichever bad actors are looking at, say, the Sanifu system or whatever, or the client system, it's not intercepted during the transit. And obviously, we do have other third-party solutions we use, like, for example, AWS. We run on AWS, Amazon Distributed Infrastructure. That ensures that we have access to the best security in terms of data. We have some of the best actually engineers in Africa right now. We have engineers who are based in Nairobi. We have engineers based in San Francisco. We have a few in South Africa as well. So in every location we have to be compliant. In Kenya, we have to be compliant with Data Protection Commission thing. In Europe, you have to be compliant on GDPR. In the US, you have to be compliant with SOC 2. In South Africa, they have POPIA Act and things like that. And all those acts, they have their own stipulations in terms of what you're supposed to do. Like South Africa is the hardest. Like it's probably harder than the US. You have to ensure that your data is domiciled there. They have to see your infrastructure in terms of where you are hosting the data. That means if, for example, you're servicing customers in South Africa, you can't host on Amazon, for example. They have to tell you, okay, you have to host our data here, as an example. So we have to ensure that all that integration meets the specifications of each country that we service. So I would say encryption is the biggest thing we look at, and then also ensuring that each client exists as a different tenant in our systems. That means, like, if there's something happening in a client, say ERP, it doesn't affect any of our other clients. So we have a bit of isolation in terms of how we set up all our clients. The other things are a bit technical in terms of some of the solutions we use, but those are the main areas that we look at.
Sufficient? Excellent. So we'll go to the gentleman who had also asked the question before, and then there as well. If the team could help me keep tabs. I'm a bit low here, so I'm just seeing hands shooting up. I'm not quite sure whose shoulders they belong to.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Huge fan of this conversation. So, James, thank you so much. And Bogwa, thank you for giving me the chance. My name is Mitchell. I'm from Dalberg Data Insights. And I have a specific question for Somet. Quantum 360. My background is in actuarial science, so early on in my career, I spent a lot of time helping local organizations secure licensing from the regulator. And as part of the documentation we submitted and during the product design phase, we'd argue these companies would use or rather augment AI in their workflows. These are the benefits to the industry, da, 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 da. Now the question for you then, and Boko, you're right, as part of the research we did, we found there were two loss-making portfolios, motor private, like you said, Bogo, and also medical. And I'm just thinking, it's a clear, like the value Q360 is providing is very clear on motor. Do you see an opportunity for us to have these conversations with your insurance partners at the product design stage? See how we can expand comprehensive cover, perhaps to cover medical. And secondly, is medical, healthcare, can you replicate the same claims process in healthcare or medical? Is this something that you have in scope, maybe X years down the line?
Yeah, so fun story. When we started with Axios, we actually piloted an idea of doing pet insurance. And so from a technology perspective, being able to digitize different sort of processes in different types of insurances, so whether it's medical, vehicle, the technology exists out there. So there are already startups that are looking at, in the medical space, how do you start to digitize claims processes? How do you start to digitize the own processes within in the insurance industry? So what we decided to do is to build an ecosystem around motor vehicles. And that's what we've spent the last couple of years doing, because there's so much in the motor space that still needs a lot of work. So whether that's one, what does a vehicle damage look like? What does a claim process look like? So right now, a lot of the work that we do is how do we help insurance companies make that decision faster in paying out your claim? What they then do beyond that, we don't have visibility for now, but there is definitely opportunities to say, hey, how do we go further down and look at, okay, you're going to write off this car or you're going to do a repair. How are you pricing parts? Because if you look at now the parts industry, as soon as any insurance company says, hey, we're looking for this part, everyone hikes their price by like 20%. So there's still an opportunity where we can say, hey, how do we create technology to standardize how pricing of parts look like? So you can actually automate the process end to end. You do a photo inspection in your car, it looks at the damage, it knows which part, we can price the parts, immediately tell you how much the damage costs. The reality is different. So the reality is insurance companies are taking time to process, to sort of change, and there's still a lot of stuff that's fragmented. I mean, at the end of the day, if you look at a lot of regulatory processes, they're still designed around paper. I mean, we have an amazing platform for insurance to be able to track all the reports they've done for however long, but you go to insurance companies and there's usually a corner somewhere with a ton load of files. So yes, we can do the amazing thing of digitizing all the reports we send to insurers. There's 90-something other intermediaries who are still operating on paper. So the value for the insurance company actually doesn't change. So yes, there's massive opportunities. What we've decided to do is to focus on the motor insurance because we think that's where we can really play a good game.
Fantastic. And as we get to the next question, the team will help me locate that next one. You raise a great point. And if Sanifu and Quanta had a baby, they'd probably sort out something in that medical insurance space. What James said earlier, it's about processes. And I'll give you an example that I will probably post in the AI Kenya WhatsApp group. There is a medical insurer that when they implemented AI to look at a process flow, they decided, can we just do one that checks what has the doctor said you're suffering from versus what have you been given by the pharmacy? So if I see you've been given Bonjela, which is for mouth sores, yet you had a broken leg, immediate flag. And these guys saw, I think they saw savings of 300 million shillings in 1 year. The first year they implemented, the board was just ballistics. Like, what do you mean? Yeah, they're like, yeah, it's basic. There's a flow here, it's just that we've augmented it. And now you can see you've got trained models and you've got a workflow process. And once some of this industry starts seeing such numbers put out there, I think it reduces the friction at the C-suite level for them to say, okay, now we can approve for this thing to go, and probably see less timelines in terms of from ideation or presentation of the technology or the solution to actualization of the same. There were a few other hands. Okay, there's one there, and then we'll come up front. Remember name and organization, please.
My name is Paul Oguda from Zone 01 Kisumu. Thank you guys for what you guys are doing. So I have 2 questions, but it can be one depending on how you answer the first one. So the current systems powering, the models that are powering your solutions, are they in-house or are they proprietary, from outside? If they are not in-house, how do you mitigate against, these parties pulling, the rug out of your feet? Because we've had cases where people are building on these, cloud, and looking at the best models. I believe, looking at cloud, OpenAI, you have situations where I think recently they're changing things. A big case was the API aspect of cloud, where guys who are using their pro versions, but out of nowhere they changed. Now they are charging per API tokens.
Yeah.
Can go ahead. So, in principle and in theory, I would love to have everything in-house. The reality is, I think there is enough for everyone to do to the point where we can focus on one thing. So what I've seen, so I spent years talking to startups in my previous job, and one of the mistakes a lot of companies make is you're trying to solve 10 or 100 problems at the same time. What we've done internally is to say, we're not going to spend the next 10 years trying to perfect an AI model to understand every tiny little nuance of how Kenyans behave with their cars and then try and do that in Uganda, then in Nigeria. We've partnered with a company that spent the last almost 6 years, and that's all they do. Building a model that is good at damage detection, and there's nothing else they do. And the reason for that is they've gotten so good at it. What we're now leveraging is to say, where do we play a space? We play the space of how then do we take damage detection and build a use case around it for insurance, for ride hailing, for logistics. So I think there's enough for everyone to be good at to focus on a thing. Now, there is the inherent risk that yes, these companies can, things can change, but what we've done instead is rather than say, hey, treat these people as just a service provider, what we've done is say, hey, how do we build a partnership where we both scale together? So it's a win-win situation for everyone. So you don't end up in a situation where you just consume. At the end of the day, the reality is we can't all build everything Kenyan-based and everything in-house based. If we're to do that, it'll take us forever. So I think there's advantages to how you can leverage technologies out there to scale. Of course, then definitely there is work to do in making sure that you're putting in place structures, fallbacks, when things change. There's, of course, and that's a whole conversation around governance and, all these strategies you can put in place. But I think partnerships is the way to go. We can't do everything by ourselves.
That question has reminded me one of the questions that investors like asking. They'll always ask, what if Google builds this? What would you do? But you're like, they haven't built it, so you have to keep moving. So the question about models, if you're building infrastructure on OpenAI or Anthropic, what do you do? So in our case, we run a couple of different models depending on the context. And yes, we do have something in the medical space. We do have a couple of guys a couple of the big hospitals locally who are currently running Sanifu. And that question actually comes a lot in the medical space, like, okay, what model are you using to run this compared to, say, FMCG, right? The models behave differently based on the context. So for example, Claude and Anthropic is really, really good at any code-based stuff. So in our workflows, there are situations whereby we need to generate a bunch of code for us to generate a certain workflow. We deploy Claude a lot in those scenarios. GPT is very, very good in terms of prompt-based inputs. And then obviously once you have the input, the other side is also a different model that handles that. So you have to build a very good tech stack that is able to see how to switch based on the context. So in terms of the only model we don't use is DeepSeek because of China. So that one you are guaranteed that the data is going somewhere. So that's one we keep away from it. And partially Grok because Elon Musk can get crazy and just pull you out. So we only play safe a bit to guys who are a bit established. In terms of okay, what can we do in case maybe they decide to build their own? I mean, that's a question that you leave every single day. If you are on X, on the Twitter Spaces on X, there's always someone launching something new where they're saying, okay, Google launches XYZ, all startups will be wiped out. But as James has mentioned, as my colleague has mentioned, if you're really, really good at solving a specific vertical and a specific problem, it's very difficult for these foundational models for them to replicate what you've built. It's really, really hard. I'll give you an example. If you're trying to build, say, something I saw this in South Africa, for example, whereby in Kenya it's slightly different. In Kenya you have a supermarket sending an order on email to a manufacturer, for example. In South Africa it's different. The supermarket system is integrated to the manufacturer system, so they communicate. But there are still problems in between in terms of how you have to read the data. So when you go there, you have to figure out how do I localize Sanifu to fit the South African context? Even if you go to, actually, there are some countries where even the things are very different. How things run in Johannesburg, it's very different how things run in Joburg, especially on the spaces we operate in. So you have to really, really be on the ground and contextualize what you're building. And all these models, they're saying they're building, they're all racing to zero, whereby now the cost of tokens will be extremely cheap for anyone to build something on top. So I'll say in that aspect, we are pretty safe for now, before AGI comes.
No, and I think also a point of comfort is that locally we have like the Africa Compute Fund that's looking at people actually setting up the hardware infrastructure that will allow us to take the trained models and start running our stuff locally, which I think is great. Because this thing about when fiber cuts, there's an issue. Because whether it's Anthropic, whether it's Gemini, fiber ikikatika imekatika. Suddenly you're teteting because customer is saying system is not working. But if you now look at, say, the Africa Compute Fund, our own local data centers, keeping that traffic, first we keep the data local, if you're looking at the Kenyan context, and then you're processing it locally. Because once the models have been trained, collision detection is collision detection. Unless some new form of collision happens, and then you have to retrain the data. So I do think we're also making steps towards that. And you'll see this across different regions, whether it's local players setting up the infrastructure or the big boys and girls deciding that I'm going to put a zone in Nairobi. For example, if it's Microsoft, there's something coming up in Naivasha. If it's AWS, they've got all of these zones that are now being deployed, and you can actually put now your bare metal and run your models and data locally. I think there was one more question. You have room for one more. We'll take the last one here from the lady. And then maybe, gentlemen, as she gives her question and we wrap up this fantastic session, is what should everyone in the room be ready with before they speak with any of you? Ayugi alluded to it earlier, that there has to be a process before, so that we don't digitize inefficiencies. What do we need to be ready before it comes to talk to you guys?
Wonderful, thank you. Good morning. My name is Ngesa Maturu. I work with rural census. Just to ask you, you've spoken about building around technology that's already there. So a lot of these large language models that we're using currently are built outside the continent on data that we don't have control over and governance frameworks that we don't have oversight. What does that look like for data sovereignty for East Africa, Africa at large within the next 10, 15 years? And what do you guys think would be the trade-off for that moving forward for us to get to sovereignty?
Any takers?
Yeah, I can take that. So I think you have to break down what are you using AI for. So if you're using AI to do a thing that's pretty standard across, in my use case, damage detection. So damage detection is essentially looking at a vehicle and say what damage is on there. I'm not feeding it data about my customer. All I'm feeding it is a bunch of images of a vehicle, and all it needs to tell me is there damage? So, but then if you're trying to digitize, let's say, a claim form for healthcare, all of a sudden you're feeding this model data about humans, let's say a human's health record. That changes how you look at data sovereignty and where data is. Going back to what Mbogo was saying, so where in the cases where you're handling what GDPR likes to call personal identifiable information, then you now have to think very differently about, what tools are you using, what technologies are you using, how do you make sure that the data is used in the right way? If you need to anonymize, there's also trade-offs between anonymizing data and not anonymizing data. So I guess it boils down back to what is your use case for AI, because then that changes how you look at data sovereignty. If I look at the way in which our businesses, let's take an example for Kenya, the amount of compute power we all collectively need as a country versus other markets, that changes also the dynamics of, what's the cost of investment of, so let's say I'm running a small startup. Do I foot the cost of investing in hardware, build my own data center so that I can build a model locally? By the time I am getting to actually solving my problem, I will be broke because of the cost of infrastructure. Now, can I find other workarounds that allow me to move faster and actually, because at the end of the day, we're all building businesses. I don't think there's anyone who's here running a business for charity unless you're an NGO. So the end goal is to make money. So there's very many ways to look at it. I guess it boils down back to what is your use case for AI. But I think there's interesting innovations happening in the space around data. So yes, we can talk about data protection and all these things. And then, as I said earlier in my presentation, there's the other side of human ingenuity and human behavior that might completely change your entire business model upside down. We can have this conversation after. I can spend hours on this.
Just something small to add. I mean, for us, the policy we have at Sanifu is just in your question about data sovereignty and what will happen when all these things, regulation starts happening. For us, we play global but act local. I don't think right now, if you're building a business that's going to scale, I don't think you need to think about that. That's our perspective, essentially. You need to think about can you build this solution for someone in California to use it, or someone in Europe to use it, someone in Cape Town to use it. That's what we mean by play global. That means you have to look at the global standards, how the global standards framed around data, how the global standards framed around data sovereignty. For example, if you're processing data for a customer in the US or Europe or some other places, how are you supposed to read that data? So we basically build our entire infrastructure around that. In terms of acting local, now to your question is, okay, now how do you contextualize the model or whatever technology we are using now to the local use case? I would say in enterprise, the differences are very minimal, unless you're building like African languages model, which I think companies like Vambo AI are doing really well. Unless you're building something around that where you're entirely reliant on a bit of contextualization, there's very minimal things that we can do on our side to just contextualize how this system behaves locally. The only thing that we checked with utmost adherence is where will for example, where does the customer prefer this data to be stored? Because that is a huge thing for enterprise customers. So we say, okay, based on your requirements, this is where we're able to store your data. And also, I mentioned earlier about how each country prefers, maybe if you're processing, say, information about, say, patients, for example, most of that information has to be locally stored. So you have to, in terms of the data processing, in terms of the architecture you use, you have to essentially localize it to fit the local standards. But anyone building a business, I think I would encourage you to just think on a global basis. Start from the global perspective and then start working your way down. That will enable you basically to build a venture scalable business. I think the other things you can just adjust on along the way.
Excellent. I like poking the Simba in all these conversations. And the question to the room, and I know we've got our gracious sponsor, Samsung, in the room as well. If you've got any of the Samsung gear tracking your steps, etc., are we talking about data sovereignty now because of AI? What's already been there? Alfred asked a great question and said, how many of us are even using local email systems? Let's start from there. Where's that data sitting? What information do you put on your emails? What information do we share on our phones? Are we just poking the bear and starting to talk about data sovereignty because of a new technology that is here? What's happened before? Does it make a difference? Right? The other analogy I like to use in closing is we all understand, or we all know that a car can move. But we have to understand the workings of the engine and where the oil was made and where the oil is going. Or do we really just want to get from point A to point B? Food for thought, ladies and gentlemen. Please help me appreciate my two panelists this morning. And as we exit, like we said, they're both here. It's great that also Ayugi is still in the room. Feel free to ask them your questions. So maybe a quick photo op with the two gentlemen here. Just eyes front to the team.